Yes, I've been studying agriculture and food, I'll put it that way around, for 40 years or more, as an undergraduate and then as a PhD student. I studied farm families, and I was interested in farm families because I realised, coming from a rural area in the UK, initially my childhood from farming and rural areas, that it was a family business, and I was interested to know why and how these families connected, and wanted to know how the social organisation of farming worked and how they managed the land. So I did a PhD in socio-economic structure of farming, and interviewed nearly 200 farmers, families, and traced their networks and generations and that sort of socio-economic structure of farming. And then continued that more generally in the 1980s, but then it expanded, the area of interest expanded, partly in line really with the growing environmental agenda that was developing. So when I started looking at farming and agriculture, the environmental movement was not so strong, but it grew in the 80s, in the 1980s particularly. So, but then I also realised that it was necessary to look at food systems, not just farming. So I took a broader supply chain approach to the subject, and began getting interested in European debates at that time in the mid-80s as well on food and agriculture, and then kept that interest going through the 80s and 90s, but also then developing that more broadly into rural environmental issues and policy, governance questions. So it's been a story of widening the vector of interest, and also, fortunately for me, doing it during a period when the environment's become more mainstream subject to study. Yeah, I mean, again, when I started on this venture, the issue of rural areas was fairly much a minority sport in the UK. Particularly, it's a very urbanised country, and a lot of people were looking at urban issues, and rural was seen as a bit of a backwater, both historically and in terms of research areas. And so I was quite isolated really in looking at rural areas in those days initially. Today, if I can move to the agenda today, my view is, and I've just finished a book on this subject on agri-food and rural development, my belief is that rural areas are by no means backwaters in the debates about environmental problems and indeed solutions. So, you know, my recent research in the last 10 years has been very much about how you can manage rural resources in a broad sense, not just in terms of land, but water, the biosphere, how you can manage them in a more sustainable way for what is effectively an urban-based population of the world now. You know, the majority of people live in cities of one form or another. The fact that they do live in cities means that they need to rely on rural resources from a detached point of view, because they're not linked to rural resources. So there's an issue here of how we sustain rural resources, the water, the land, the energy that can be produced, the amenity that can be produced, and the food and so on. how they can be sustained for a population, an increasing population, that are not associated with rural areas. So the issue of functional and harmonious links between rural and urban becomes an important subject, and the governance thereof, of understanding how you manage rural resources for that sort of population. I'm also aware that the majority of land is farmed by small families and farmers and peasants, as well as the growth of agribusiness, and what we have to protect and nurture is sustainable livelihoods on the land. We're now in a position that we have got major environmental global problems, both in terms of climate change affects carbon emissions and resource depletion. Both of those two things are not necessarily related, but they're both impacting on the 21st century. They're impacting on the 21st century when, as I was saying, population is more and more urban based, detached from the land, and they are impacting at a time when the population is expanding. They're operating at a time when we realise we have to go post-carbon and reduce carbon emissions. So the problems we've got now are of a magnitude that certainly were not necessarily recognised when I started my career, but they're of an order which puts a lot of pressure on how you manage rural resources and rural people in those conditions. So I call this going back to the biosphere, in a sense, that it's going back to, I say back to because in a sense we relied on it in the pre-industrial period, but we're now having to go back to the biosphere for most of our resources, whether it's water, energy, renewable energy, food, farming and amenity. So the primacy and the scarcity of rural resources is I think a big issue for contributing to the transitions we need to make in society, in our management of resources, which were not quite so recognised or so urgent 40 years ago. They are global issues, but they play out, and one might argue that their solution lies in place-based approaches. And in fact, I run a research institute called Sustainable Places, which takes a multidisciplinary approach to place making, as we call it, or place adaptation. So yes, and I think there is part of this a process of reterritorialization, or the recognition that okay, we've had globalization, we've got globalization, we've got vast amounts of migration, we've got the Internet of Things, we've got all sorts of ways in which we are becoming, or a lot of us are becoming, increasingly globalized. But at the same time, paradoxically, the solutions to many of these problems lie within different places. So an emphasis on place is important. Now we have to be careful about that and not to fall into what some scholars call the local trap. The local trap, that is to say that we wouldn't want to build walls around places and defensive localism, as it's called. Neither do we want to say that everything that's good locally is sustainable and global is bad. I don't adhere to that dictum. But having said that, then what becomes important is understanding what we call the rural web, the web of relations, that are both external and internal to the rural places. So places are made up of two sets of communities, place-based communities and communities of interest, as they're called. So we're all members of different communities of interest that are across places or in various ways. But we're also involved in places, not necessarily just one place. We might, clearly our residence is one place, but it's only one place. There are other places that we might live and work in different places. So place-based approaches are one important, often ignored, but one very important element in unravelling the problems we face, finding some of the solutions to it. The other problem, and this is where I was influenced a lot by, I think one of the questions you were preparing to ask me was who's been influential. There's no doubt that Marxist analysis of the 1980s and 90s was very influential to me, particularly David Harvey's notion of spatial fix. And the interesting about spatial fixes is that places rely on other places. And this is an issue because we rely on importation of foods. Our footprints are, wider and wider. So we can have very nice places like this where we sit today, and wealthy places, but these wealthy places are also dependent on other places where we fix our trading relations or our footprints in various ways. So this is a process of uneven development, and this arises as coincidentally, not necessarily from a Marxist analysis at all, but it arises as a major issue now in the issues of global environmental change. And you saw in COP21 the discussions in Paris 2 years ago about the difficulties many northern countries had of advocating reductions in carbon emissions to countries like India. Said, well, hang on, we haven't had your level of development yet. So, and so you can see here that there are spatial fixes on processes of uneven development which have to be embedded in our understanding of sustainability discourses and policies, and therefore we're dealing here with often scarce resources, so we have to manage. So the environmental question becomes a development question as well, I think, a global development and a local development question. So this again, I think, is where you see a new post-normal science developing, which is integrating different disciplines that need to come together to try to resolve these sorts of problematics. Good point. This burns me a lot now because I strongly believe that we need to make more impression as social scientists on the problems we've just been addressing, and I think for too long we've been rather timid at that we've been for all sorts of reasons. Many social scientists have not wanted to go down a route of normativity or preaching to people or saying what should happen, and that's understandable in many respects. So the critical analysis has been very sort of dominant, and I would agree that it needs to be still a major part of what we do, but it needs to be balanced with also a more practical approach, perhaps a bit like Karl Popper was talking about social technologies. I mean, you've got to be very careful about that because we had our fingers burnt in many respects by these sorts of things, by the rise of fascism and the wartime, and even planning in the 1960s was a bit of a disaster. So, we haven't necessarily got a good history of intervening or trying to influence this. But I think it's becoming absolutely critical because in many respects, from where I stand, and some other physical scientists have been saying this in the last Rio summit, for instance, they were saying this is going to be the century of social science. It's going to be the century when we know what the environmental, natural science problems are, general terms, but the question is what how do we reorganise society in ways which relieve those problems, or ameliorate them, or mitigate them, or resolve them. And you know, that's the sort of problem that the early social scientists in the 19th century didn't really have. They had other problems. They had problems of urban pollution, urban squalor, rise of rapid industrialisation, problems of how to feed the population and manage food security and sustainability, although they didn't use those words in those days. And they developed a social science apparatus which was largely social, it was largely human-based. Now we have to recognise that we need to be more politically engaged and policy engaged, and that we have to take natural and social science together in trying to resolve these sorts of issues. No, so I think that's I'm very optimistic about all this. I'm not a pessimist about the way the world is going in this direction, and I think it gives me and a lot of other people, and should give us a lot of social scientists a lot of vitality to try to address these issues, an opportunity to make a difference.